I'm Marie Fehlinker from Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law and a member of the Women in Legal Education Oral History Task Force for the American Association of Law Schools. We're here on January 8th, 2016 at NYU Law School with Professor Emily Hartigan from St. Mary's School of Law, and I want to also thank Patrick Whiteman from NYU Law School for his assistance in doing this interview. Emily, tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up.
Well, I was actually born in Washington, D.C., but we moved when I was 6 months old, so it sort of doesn't count. And then the rest of my growing up years were in Virginia. My grade school years in Alexandria, before and after in Norfolk, because Dad was in the Navy.
Okay. Tell me about your family. Who was in your family at this time when you were growing up?
Well, my dad, my mom, my older sister, and I. My dad was JAG, Navy JAG, legal officer, and mom was, housewife. She was every bit as intellectual as my father, but all she did, unfortunately, was, be able to read books and talk with him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did she have any particular outside interests that she was involved with because of her intellectual interests, or?
Not really. She had some health challenges that really restricted her ability to do anything in a sustained way.
Okay, okay.
So.
And siblings, you mentioned?
Yep, older sister,
right,
who also became a lawyer eventually.
Okay.
So.
And tell us a little bit about the neighborhoods or the communities where you grew up in Alexandria and Norfolk.
Well, my grade school years were in a neighborhood that was new construction, but it was very, very small row houses. So it was the people who lived in it tended to be, and because of my mom's health problems, we had income problems, were working class. So it was an interesting, very interesting working class neighborhood.
And were there family, friends, or other people that were sort of influential in your life during this period, your early years? Teachers, friends?
Well, I would say primarily I went to Catholic school, and it was walking distance, and that community was pretty strong, and the nuns, both sides, both the very human mix that they are. Certainly I had some that I need to keep practicing forgiveness on, but others that were part of the tradition in a way that made both me and my sister really connected to Catholic social justice stuff.
So tell us a little bit more about that, your experience as a girl in a Catholic school. Did that have any influence on you and what you grew up to be?
Well, on the one hand, it's like, the biggest, baddest person on the block was Sister St. Joan. But she wasn't bad, but she was just a very no-nonsense, very smart and talented woman. So that the idea that women were helpless or anything like that really wasn't on the radar from Catholic school. And the other thing is that I started for quite ignoble adolescent reasons going to daily mass, and that really stuck, and I did that for as long as I could given the geographical logistics. And that turned out to be probably my first conscious encounter with the depth of mystery, and that something incredibly important was going on, and I knew I didn't fully understand it, and I knew that it wasn't, in the end, wasn't an intellectual thing, but that it was just something, because lots of the time, of course, during the winter, it was still dark, and so I would get up in the dark and walk to the church on my own in the dark and be in this dark church with, a bunch of the nuns and 2 or 3 other, my best friend tended to go to people, and it was just a very incubating kind of experience.
Well, what kinds of academic interests or hobbies did you have then when you were in grade school? Any particular books you loved to read, or?
Yeah, a lot of the books that my parents had read, the Jack London, Booth Tarkington, stuff like that my parents had read, and so we tended to read,
Sure.
all the things that they sort of passed on to us. The Hardy Boys. Interesting to me in retrospect, I didn't want to read Nancy Drew. She didn't work for me. I didn't identify with her. I identified with the Hardy Boys
Interesting.
because they didn't have restrictions.
Oh, okay.
And I was a tomboy and I didn't want restrictions.
Okay.
And so I read all the Hardy Boys mysteries. And, and did some sort of heavier reading. But that was really dependent on my parents, who were both bibliophiles. I mean, they both read it. We went to the Alexandria City Library at least once a week. And we have pictures of Mom with her big stack of books every. So.
Did she have some particular interests, reading interests, or?
Well, lots of stuff. I mean, she read a lot of, she read existentialism. I can remember her sort of take on it. And, since there was nobody else to talk to, she talked to my sister and me. So we got this sort of really interesting take from, and when Dad came home, there would be a conversation back and forth. She read things like Angela Thirkle, I don't know, that, sort of, what's his name? I never can spell. Samuel Pepys, however anyway, those kinds of things, but also philosophy, lots of history. They were both history majors. So there was just, I remember the first time when I took a major aptitude test, being aware that the reason that I knew the answer to a number of the questions, because back then for aptitude they asked things like who wrote Les Miserables, was because my parents had talked about it. So, I mean, it was a huge class advantage. But I'm not sorry that I had the opportunity.
Were there things that you did outside of school, in grade school, high school?
Well, in grade school, not so much. I mean, the one thing that I remember when thinking about your prior question also is that they listened to all the, this was the Washington area, they listened to all the Army McCarthy stuff that was televised. That is, everything that was going on politically. I knew who all the cabinet people were much better than right now, because they were really immersed in it, and that's a lot of what we did. I mean, they were very interested in talking about politics and relating it to history. So that was, I did a lot of sort of playing in the neighborhood. And that was fun to get the physical activity, but for the intellectual stuff, that was theirs.
Now, when you lived in Alexandria, did you go into DC proper often, or not so much?
We would periodically. I mean, I remember we went to Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concert, came and gave one, and the original Pooh animals, Winnie the Pooh animals, were in the lobby. Things like that were sort of special things. And then if Mom felt bad and Dad had symphony tickets, I would get to go with him. So, but it was, back then where I lived, it was not Nova, it was not Northern Virginia, there was this city over there. But my sister came back in high school from a trip, because they had series concerts, things for her high school, and my parents asked her, well, who'd you see? And she said, oh, some fiddler guy, and it was Yehudi Menuhin. I would tell this, because, here was St. Mary's Academy trooping off and seeing these extraordinary, I saw Maria Talchief and, really wonderful things in retrospect that, of course, we couldn't really appreciate. But then we moved to Norfolk, and that was just a huge shift. just, wow.
In what ways?
Norfolk, at that time, I went to Granby High School, which was the largest public high school in Virginia at that time. And it had just been through shutting down rather than integrate. So when I got there, there were, I think, 2 black kids out of 3,000 students. And when I walked in the first day, I stayed friends the whole time with the other girl in the entire, who didn't wear loafers that first day of school. I wore saddle shoes and so did Susan, and my mother immediately took me to get a pair of loafers, the correct brand and everything. I mean, it wasn't the sort of cosmopolitan and diverse thing that DC just was.
Yeah.
You know, you just had more.
So were they mostly military kids, or were
They were
upper class?
mostly Tidewater kids. They were mostly Southern Virginia,
Okay.
mostly. Now that, because the military, the Navy kids were considered a little, you know,
Okay.
because they hadn't been there for generations.
Sure. So what kinds of things were important in high school? Academics, non-academic things? What did you have spark to a particular course or area?
I have to, you know, I will, I'm old enough, I can confess. It was, for me, it was sort of the right thing in the end,
Yeah.
was that my sort of adolescent hormonal energy was, even though I was becoming an agnostic, I still had a very sort of strong sense of boundaries, and so all of that energy went into a huge, I mean, my prior crush had been on Ezio Pinza, and that was okay by my parents, okay, because he did wonderful opera. But he died, and and I fell in love with Dick Clark. And so my sort of visceral motivation in a lot of ways, I had my parents' agenda, which is you've got to do a lot of things so you can have them on your resume so you can go to college, okay? And that was important, and I did all those things, you know, debate club, French club, all those kinds of things. And if I got all A's, which I otherwise would not have gotten because I was an A and C student. If I didn't like it, you know, I didn't really apply. If I got all A's, I got $10 and permission if I'd saved my allowance, which I did, and all my Christmas money and everything. I could take the bus up to Philadelphia to bandstand. So that's how my parents got me to have sufficiently good grades so that along with my test scores, I could go to Swarthmore.
Okay, bandstand. Tell us about bandstand. What was it like?
Well, part of what was, I think, terrific about it for me in retrospect, there were all kinds of things. One of them was that fortunately Dick Clark, as he put in one of his later books, didn't mess with the little girls. We were really lucky, the group of us. We formed a small coterie of fans. So it was relatively safe, except that it was in West Philadelphia in a bad neighborhood. But that meant that I continued to have the experience that, you know, my parents now living in a middle-class neighborhood that I wouldn't have had. And the majority of the kids who went to the show were working class. And, you know, in terms of my sort of intellectual interests and stuff like that, I just was, you know, stuck out like a sore thumb. But it kept me really connected with, you know, with good and interesting people who were my friends, who were not from my sort of family of origin, socioeconomic status. Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that I did, you know,
so
that happened.
You'd go and dance with
Yes,
bandstand?
yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Yep.
And so you formed a group, actually a community up there.
Well, it was actually from a national, there were teen magazines back then,
Mm-hmm.
teen magazines.
Yes.
Okay, and they listed fan clubs,
Yes.
and I was the president of Dick Clark Fan Club number 1432.
Okay.
But I mean, I met these incredibly, one young woman conned her parents into letting her move to Philadelphia, to Drexel Hill, when she was 16 and have her own apartment. And so Janelle, who was my friend, she still lived in Alexandria, but you know, we would go and converge at Myra's apartment in Philadelphia, in Drexel Hill, and live this very strange but my parents, as long as I was the responsible one and as long as I was getting good grades, they let their 14-year-old go on the bus by herself to Philadelphia. When I think about it, it's sort of, you know, amazing. But that meant that then, you know, we would come up to New York and, you know, go to, I saw things like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, you know, Tom Stauber, when I was like 16. So there was a whole range of experiences that I don't think I would have had if it hadn't been for this wild hair of, you know. And I think and I know that I saw him as representing normalcy and kind of decency, and you know, he was affirming that teenagers were human beings also. So it was, you know, it wasn't, and I got to see tremendous, you know, musical stuff right there, you know, in person. So it was great fun. And he lived, when he lived in Philadelphia, he moved the year before I was applying to colleges out to the West Coast. He lived about 1.5 miles from Swarthmore campus. And so that was an added vector in my
So that's when Swarthmore kind of came on your radar.
being so clear. Well, at that time, Swarthmore was, you know, the sort of my snotty, young, competitive side. It was the hardest school for women to get into because, of course, at that time, you couldn't go to, all the Ivy League was closed. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Williams, none of those places accepted women. So all the women applicants were sort of, they had a very narrow chute of schools that they could apply to. And so there was that aspect. I mean, I look back and think that's not my most sort of noble set of, but I was competitive. And my dad had great admiration for the Quakers, and that was part of the whole Swarthmore thing, the whole legacy of it and its progressive nature, even though they were Republicans and I would have considered myself a Republican, but it still had a sort of deeply conscientious turn to it.
Sure.
Okay, so.
So were there any other sort of important moments in your high school career or recollections about being a girl in a public high school in Virginia that influenced you? Or important?
Well, I liked to play sports, and of course there were no girls' sports teams. But I found, you know, the sort of private leagues and
So what did you play?
softball and basketball.
Okay.
I was not any good at all, but I loved it.
Yeah.
So I, you know, stuck with it. And you know, it was, you know, I had walked directly into a highly structured caste system, you know, the Tidewater, Virginia caste system. And it was very visible to me. And obviously being on the downside, initially, though eventually, because my dad went to work for the firm, the sort of old, the Kellum bird machine firm, you know, that changed some. But I had this experience of exclusion that I think was probably good for me. And then my senior year, as I was graduating, my English teacher, who had become like a surrogate mom to me, she was a wonderful influence. She said, you know, you talk a lot in a sort of liberal way, but are you going to be interested? There's this voter registration project that the League of Women Voters and the Junior League are helping to sponsor. And this was the summer of '64. And I said, sure. So I spent much of the summer of '64 with the Tidewater voter registration project.
Who were you registering him?
Poor African Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, it was part of the, it was the national YWCA, but it was affiliated with, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I was the only white kid from Norfolk doing it. All the other people from Norfolk were black high school and college students. There were white kids who came down, college students. There were a bunch of students who came down there, but I forget, about 10.
So what influence did that have on you, that experience?
Wow. Lots of things. One of them was the conversations, and the Go Set a Watchman just came out, the Harper Lee follow-up to Kill a Mockingbird, and I just taught it in my law and lit class. It's really interesting because, my dad at one point, they would not help me at all. Okay, so I had to take the bus down to the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, and if it was a new bus driver, he would always say, "Are you sure you want to go to the Phyllis Wheatley?" I would say, "Yes, sir, I do." Then Dad started saying, so-and-so, said, "Fred, was that Emily down at the courthouse?" I thought I saw her down there with all those. And back then, negras, that was colored people. I mean,
Right.
Nobody said black or African American back then. And listening to the way the conversations unfolded was just the way in which people were in process. So that at one point, my parents said, "Emily, you cannot come home after dark in the car with any of them." And them obviously meant African Americans, but particularly they were two of the guys who were driving were the president and vice president of the Booker T Student Council, just graduating, and they were young black men. And I, went back the next day and talked to the woman who was heading the project, and this is where I learned they're just so much smarter than we are, honey. I mean, she had such a sophisticated take on it, and she said, "Okay, this is what we're going to do, you just go home tomorrow as you did last night, okay, and you have everybody in the car come up to the door, and when you go in, you say, Mom and Dad, I brought some friends. I'd like to introduce you to them." Okay? That's what I did. My parents were completely polite. They sat around and talked for a while, okay? Then all the other people left me there. My parents never said another thing about it. It just, when they met these people, they couldn't objectify them. And so the process of, and my dad's conversations with the senior partner in his firm, and how he shared, we were told we couldn't even shake hands with them. And so when I went to Swarthmore, and people were so clear, they had such moral clarity about other people, and it blew some fuses that it took a while I couldn't jump right into social action stuff because I could hear the judgment, and that didn't work for me. The judgment about the effect of the behaviors did work. I mean, I was so glad I did the voter registration, and it was just being in those homes in the projects and seeing and smelling and experiencing that incredible poverty was galvanizing, but it didn't come together for a while, in part because, no, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. So, it confused me. And I think Swarthmore was a good place to go with that confusion.
So was that the only place you really were interested in going into Swarthmore, or did you?
I applied to other places, but it really was, I mean, it was clear to me that sort of there was this convergence of all this stuff, because I was beginning to understand that this stuff with Clerk was a little, you know, I was getting some perspective on it, but it still was a kind of, this is a place where that the sort of the river of energy is leading you, and I was very much an agnostic at that point. So I was sort of as feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. I was trying to navigate in a way that had sort of rational components. I mean, it was absolutely, at that time, it was ranked #1 among liberal arts colleges. So,
and it was a women's college at that time?
No, it was always co-ed.
It
was always co-ed. Swarthmore has always been co-ed. Oh, you non-Quaker. No, seriously, it's always been co-ed. It was known as the Quaker Matchbox, the Hicksites deliberately. You know, Bryn Mawr was the women's college, Haverford was the men's college, and Swarthmore was the deliberate matchbox. So, you know, the sense of, and it was small. My high school had been too big, and so the caste system had been too hard to fight through. And with a smaller community that had a real spirit to it and was intellectually really challenging, all of that, and good values, and plus it's a beautiful campus, you know.
So what was your major? What did you study?
I ended up studying philosophy. That was my major.
What particular kind did you resonate to? What branch of philosophy?
Well, actually, one of the things that happened to me is that I had, and it's much too long a story, but I had a fascinating, slightly predatory Catholic, brilliant guy. He wrote, you know, there's a journal, Mind, which for many years was some considered the primary sort of philosophy journal. And he wrote an article that appeared in it, and I didn't notice this, Munro Beardsley did, that was called Thoughts. So he wrote thoughts that appeared in Mind. I mean, he just was brilliant. But he was also, he was very human. And I had him for philosophy of language, which was primarily Wittgenstein. And that was that blew me into postmodernism. I mean, it located me so that the modern and pre-modern was interesting, but in a sense still stuck in the sort of Enlightenment rationalism, and so it still had an interest to me, but it had become clear you couldn't really, I thought at first that you could prove the truth, that I could find the truth. And Wittgenstein helped me realize that no, you can do really interesting things about truth, but you're not going to be able to prove it, and you're not going to be able to find it. And that going after it with a hatchet, which is what I had been doing, just chopping through, you know, math. I quit my math science curriculum when I found out, you don't need to know the details. Why the least upper bound problem, it became arbitrary, and they made an arbitrary decision, and all of calculus and higher math is based on that. And it was like, but it's not true. And, you know, so I was still looking for that. Mm-hmm. And so I that made me not be looking for truth as a primarily intellectual thing, which for some period I did think that was going to be where it was. And I had started going to meeting because it was a silent meeting and you could just go and meditate. And that was just it was a very, very good place to go when you find out that all of this wonderful stuff, which is going on, in the end, there's something more. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I finished out the philosophy degree. I was glad, and probably the social and political philosophy, I read John Rawls' The Article, which was the core of a theory of justice, the article which was Justice is Fairness. And that was a real, you know, it was like, this is wonderful, you're not going to get much further intellectually in a sense, and I could see problems with it and things like that. I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation primarily on it, on the book. But for the intellectual stuff, I was moving into something which was more of a practice hybrid, so that I went to graduate school in political science to do political theory.
So what made you decide did you go, I can't remember if you went straight from Swarthmore to graduate school, or?
I went straight, except that it was bent a little bit because I went to Europe the summer of '68, and I met Milovan Djilas, who, had written The New Class and Conversations with Stalin, and I showed up in Belgrade because I wanted to go to Prague because I'd written my senior thesis on or senior major paper on the Prague Spring. And some student picked me up, took me to her English professor, and she said, "Oh, you'll want to meet Djilas," because he had just been released about, 8 months before or something. So I went and spent the afternoon talking with him. I mean, there were things, but then when I got to Prague, I got there 2 days before the Russians invaded. And so that bent me towards the practical even further, because
You were there after the invasion?
during the invasion.
Yeah.
Okay, the boom's in the middle of the night,
Sure.
as they're invading.
Sure.
I'd fallen in love with the theory, with socialism, with the human face. It was wonderful. But if you're a huge country like the Soviet Union or the United States, you can just come in and stomp people who have beautiful ideas. And where, people had been doing check shifts, they'd been working for free to try to, say, we'll still send you money, because the Soviet Union, of course, bled money out of the satellite nations, and didn't matter. If you had the tanks and you had the guns, you could come in and just smush people. And so that turned me even more towards sort of what's going on in practical politics.
So then next, after your experience in Prague?
So at the end of that August, God, it must have been literally about 10 days later, because it was August 21st that the invasion was. I ended up in Madison, Wisconsin. And again, that was an almost magical period. The guy who picked us up at the airport, I had made friends on the plane with a very pretty young woman who was from South Carolina, who was coming to graduate school. And we landed, and she had a room, which is where I crashed. I had no place to go. And but our taxi driver was a guy named Paul Soglin, who was the leader of left-wing politics and became mayor, and then mayor again. He may even be, I can't remember if he's mayor now, but of Madison. And so he gave us this whole introduction to Madison, which was, things were happening in the fall of '68 in Madison that could not be ignored.
Right. So were you a part of that, or were you pretty much just working on your degree? Did you?
I was never an organized part. I did go and do some demonstrations and get gas, but that was it. In part because I still had this suspicion born from the voter registration experience about being so sure that you're right and what that meant. And I considered myself a Quaker. I had started attending meeting regularly and was a pacifist. And so, they were starting, I can remember being awakened in the middle of the night with this huge blast and going, oh God, they've gone too far. And it was the explosion that blew up the Army Math Research Center and killed Robert Fosnaugh, who was in his lab that night. So there wasn't an easy location. I was doing stuff with the Quakers, though. Yeah.
Like what?
Various peace marches. That was the primary thing. Eventually I became convener of peace and social concerns for the Madison meeting. So it was all
And
that.
so what was it like to be a woman in your PhD program? Was that a good experience or not so much? Or?
Well, it was very interesting. At that time, my memory is that 17% of political science graduate students at major universities were women. It was not a field that women went into very much. So I was very much in the minority. And I can remember Clara Penniman, she was the woman, telling my friend Marilyn Miller, now Dixon, and I, you have to make a choice. You can't both be married and be a political scientist. Which we really didn't want to hear because we really still liked guys.
Right.
But that was, this was what the woman was telling us. And the men, oh gosh. Oh, and yeah, no, they expected us to drop out, and they said things like that, on the faculty. It was.
How about did they grade you fair? Did they treat your work fairly? Did you get criticized for things that you think were improper because you're a woman?
It's really hard to tell, but I've got to say that when I went to law school and started operating under the anonymous grading system, my first semester, I was first in my class by a significant margin under anonymous grading, and I was floored, because that's not what was happening in political science. So, to me, that was the easiest marker that things were. But it's also true, to give them some space, that I ended up marrying my advisor, who was only 6.5 years older than I. He was totally on the up and up. Neither of us were, But, and we didn't date or do anything while I was in his class. But I think that did make it harder for his colleagues, because I was a faculty wife for the last 3 years of my doctoral program. So I think that did make it hard for them, given what was going on. But, I was on the American Political Science Association panel, the first one on Rawls' book, Theory of Justice. I was the token graduate student. And because my advisor, Murray Edelman, got me on it. And after the panel, the person who was head of recruiting at the University of Chicago, sent a letter to the department saying, oh, we saw her, we really want to know, we'd like to, blah, blah, blah. They sent Larry Joseph's credentials, not mine. We really think you'd be interested in Larry Joseph. And, that it was just.
So how did that lead into your decision to go to law school, or maybe it was not influential? I don't know.
The decision to go to law school, there are all kinds of sexism, and some of it happens in your personal relationships. And my husband, who was a recently but tenured professor at Wisconsin, and I had helped with that because I was an assistant dean in letters and science, and I had done this lobbying with people, but he was a wonderful teacher. Didn't do squat in scholarship back then, but he was a wonderful, gifted teacher. So I got the perfect job offer after going through the, their version of the meat market, which was to teach at Douglas College, Rutgers. The public women's college. There would be people who were there not from privilege, but because they, there were all kinds of things about it that were wonderful, and there was a partial administrative appointment because I had been an assistant dean. So it was like, well, if I don't get tenure, I can, go with that, okay? Seemed perfect. And He basically communicated that that would be the end of the marriage.
So that was that.
I said, well, let me see. I've done administrative stuff, and I've got the PhD, and law is really interesting. And I'd helped organize the Madison academic staff. I was co-founder and first chair of something called the Madison Academic Staff Association. So in doing that, I just learned all kinds of things, and it was really interesting. But it was clear to me there was lots of law involved in administrative stuff and organizing and all that. So I thought, oh, well, and law, that would really help with any of these. It's like plus, both and. So why don't I go to law school?
So how long was it between when you started your PhD and then you had the job while you were?
While I was writing my dissertation.
And how many years was that you worked as the assistant dean before you went to law school? If you remember.
Well, I started as assistant to the associate, so total 5 years.
Okay.
5 years.
Okay, and so did you quit that job when you went to law school?
I tried to do that and go to law school. And I did do that and go to law school. And I was first in my class by this margin after that first semester. And then I got pregnant. Okay, and that's when, and the long story short is that Ben was born in October, and my body just crashed me. I had a severe postpartum depression because I was trying to do way too many things. Yes, I thought if I gave up the Quaker volunteer activities, that would take care of it, and I could still work half time, be pregnant, and I mean, really, when I look back, but it was hard to get markers about what you could and couldn't do, because there was this whole narrative threaded throughout of Clara Penniman said you can't be both married and be a political scientist, so that you knew some of the things you were being told by well-meaning other women weren't true. And so it was really hard to tell what was and wasn't true in terms of what you could and couldn't do. So I overshot the mark. I had to drop out of law school that semester because I just, thank God for imipramine. 2.5 weeks after I started on an antidepressant, I was back.
So you were out that semester, and then did you return after the
second semester? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, what was Wisconsin like as a school, law school, and for you as a woman?
Well, we were still putting potted plants in the urinals in the ladies' rooms. I mean, it just hadn't caught up with having any significant. I think we were around 23%, but it was a very new 23%.
Any women faculty?
2, 3, something like that. Okay, now one of them was Shirley Abrahamson. So, but again, that's, Shirley walks on water and only sleeps 3 hours a night. And, I mean, there are people who are just, she's 3 people, let's face it. I mean, so, and there is a sort of, again, there's a conundrum there. Some of the older role models are people like Clara Penniman who made decisions which allowed them to do something, And then there were others like Shirley who, had a son. She was married to, Seymour, who was in the ag. Anyway, he was at the university. But she was beyond reach of the ordinary mortal. So there weren't role models. I mean,
realistic role models.
Yeah, no, there were, my jaw's dropping, and I just, I did a clerkship for her when I graduated, and I mean, just such an amazing person. But even then, I knew that I couldn't aspire to be.
So with a child, I assume pretty much was law school and taking care of your son. Did you
Yeah, I
get a
quit
chance
law
to-
review too.
Oh, okay.
You know, because I'd made it on grades, and
Sure.
it's like, why do I need to do this? I wrote a dissertation.
Right.
I know how to do
Right,
research.
right, exactly.
Right.
Okay.
So I, you know, I did make some accommodations that I
Okay.
should have
Any
made.
other significant events in law school that had an influence on you later as a law teacher? I think?
Wow. It's funny, some of the things that influenced me really weren't happening because of being an ordinary law student, because I was a faculty wife of somebody who taught political theory, and so a lot of Booth's students, and he was a real figure in their undergraduate education. He got all kinds of teaching awards. I mean, he really was very gifted in that way. And so he knew a lot of the folks on the law faculty, and they knew him, and I knew some of them before I went to law school. You know, like Jackie McCauley, Stuart and Jackie McCauley.
Mm-hmm.
I never took any of Stuart's classes, but he was one of my primary go-to people,
Yeah.
okay? And I knew Willard Hurst before I went, you know, and had dinner parties, you know, with Willard. And so I was so glad there was anonymous grading, because it was this sort of funny kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of navigating expectations. There were some downsides to that too. You know, there were some people that were not, you know, terrific in part because of that, I think.
Mhm.
But that's, I mean, is that because I was a woman? Well, it had something to do with the strange role of a faculty wife. But
Any other important things that happened or you did in law school that you think, you know, were significant to you?
well, I did learn something about what very competitive women, I began my learning process, unfortunately, of what very competitive women can do to other women.
Mm-hmm.
That was sad. I mean, I learned some positive things, obviously, some wonderful things, because people were tremendously helpful when I had been. And I have, you know, Lee Vandevelde was one of my classmates, and we have stayed in touch and shared a lot, and she has been a very supportive and positive and inspiring friend. So there was very much the positive side, but I did begin to experience this other thing, which hadn't happened in the poli-sci setting, interestingly enough. But it did start.
So were you thinking about law teaching at that point, or what was your plan in terms
Well,
of after law school?
I needed to stay in Madison because now I had a child, and so I really was. And, you know, I was still a Quaker then, but the thing about a vow and marriage, not as orthodoxy, but as the intrinsics of what you do when you make that commitment in the face of mystery and not knowing and the unknown future. And, you know, you're making a family. You know, that to me was just so strong. That it was like, well, gotta find something here. And I tried to find poli-sci teaching jobs, you know, in Milwaukee, and, you know, there was college, and just wasn't there, wasn't possible, was not possible. And in terms of law teaching, well, there's a story that goes with that that's not, in a sense, worth telling, but I didn't want to do that right away. Because I had a very strong sense. Several people had said to me, if you're interested on the faculty, you're interested and you want to teach, I'll support you. But I knew my tendency to abstraction meant that if I didn't practice law, I really wouldn't be able to teach law. That it wasn't primarily an intellectual, it was primarily a professional education that law was. And some people probably can do a pretty good job, but I have this tendency to just head up into the stratosphere. So I really thought I should practice.
So how did that come about?
Well, I clerked for Shirley, and then I got the clerkship I most wanted, which was for James B. McMillan in Charlotte. And he was the busing judge, the one who desegregated the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system, Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg. And he was wonderful. It was a fantastic experience. But see, again, it's, you know, the sexism closest to home is the one which is going to be, in my life, is going to be amplified the most. People really wanted to support, you know, because they really valued the judges' clerks, and he could get people from all over the country, so that people in the legal community tried to support clerks who wanted to stay in Charlotte. And so they got booths. They got him a visitorship at it was what's now, is it UNC Charlotte? Anyway, I can't remember which iteration, but they got him a job offer at Davidson, and he wasn't willing to do it. He wasn't willing to do it. So we went back to Madison. I said, well, we may be going back to Madison. I'm not going to split up my family, but you've got to go into counseling, because that was, so, you know, the career decision was, okay, then time to practice.
Okay, so tell us about your practice.
Well, I started out as an assistant attorney general, but found out that I was in the criminal appeals division, and my boss, I specifically said ahead of time, you know, there's some decisions that are just so bad that I would not want to cite them for precedent. And, you know, I want to know, can I refuse to argue things that I think are really repellent decisions, even though they would support? And he said, as long as you don't believe nobody belongs in prison. You know, because it was like, you know, the state's wrong sometimes. Suppose they're wrong. Can we, you know, okay? Well, he lied. I mean, that's, you know, there was a case that came down. It was horrible. It didn't really need to be cited. And I said, you know, I don't want to put that in my brief. I can still argue that, you know, but, and you know, he didn't fire me. I knew I needed to get out of there, because that was not going to be, it was not going to be tenable. So I had an offer from the firm, which was the sort of, I don't know, the white hat everybody wanted to go work for,
Okay.
medium-sized, 16 people, union-side labor law. And Gaylord Nelson had been in it. You know, it was, and I was the first non-family woman. One of the named partner's daughters was there, but they had walled her off. And it was a fascinating experience, but you want to talk about sexism. Oh my gosh.
Okay, like what?
The warrior class.
Okay.
Most of these guys, the majority were ex-Marines. They had this incredible, wonderful spirit in terms of community, and you know, you carry your dead with you, and just all really neat stuff, and honor, and, you know, honesty, and incredible hard work. Wonderful things. It just didn't include women. They just totally couldn't deal with me. They didn't know how to process me. And the managing partner did. And he and I really got along. And after they did various things, you know, he just took me under his wing, and we were doing great work. But they were so spooked in a way, I think, that they waited until he and I were on it. It was a major case, and I was second chair for him. And we were up in northern Wisconsin, and, you know, it was a huge PI case. And they held a meeting without him and without telling him, and said that it was time for me to go. Yeah, so they betrayed their brother in order to get me. And he came back to that as a fait accompli, and I said, don't worry, Jim, I'm going. You know, but yeah, it was, I mean, you know, I could have been a major criminal and they wouldn't have done that.
What kind of cases were you doing through this period when you were working?
It was some of the union side labors, but you know, that was shrinking, not growing.
Mm-hmm.
So plaintiff's personal injury and contract public defender work and some criminal defense that wasn't under the public defender, and a little bit of family law.
So then what did you decide to do when it was time to go?
Well, one of my colleagues from law school, one of my classmates, had been trying to get me to consider coming in with him and another couple people. So I said, okay, and I went with them. And
Same sort of work?
Same sort of work, except minus the union side labor, because you know that was the firm's business, not mine.
So you enjoyed that work?
I did enjoy it. I've got to confess that the one thing that I learned from all of this is that, you know, law firm politics they're comparable to academic politics. You know, they're no better. They may not be worse, but they're no better. So near the tail end, I did some office overhead sharing, you know, and we were like a quasi firm, and that worked well. But I had done all that. I had really enjoyed it. I did a lot of litigating, which I learned a tremendous amount from. It began to get a little wearing because the fighting part of it is not great for me. And the cheating that happened, that was just, I had trouble with, you know, other lawyers who did things like ex parte the judge and, you know, and stuff that I just, I guess I played too much Catholic League basketball or something where people actually, the refs called the fouls or something like that. And I wanted to, what I was doing to get through practice was I started reading more and more mystics. And that was the balance for me. And in this process, part of it was the first day school, adult first day school, we ran out of Quaker mystics, so one of the guys said, well, let's start reading Thomas Merton. And it became clear that all of what Quakerism had meant for me was available in my own tradition. It had been there all along. And Booth was really interested in going to the Catholic Church. And so he had been raised Episcopalian, so, you know, we started doing that. And I was, the mysticism for me taps into a very intellectual mysticism. It's postmodernism, and it appears in postmodernism. I mean, Derrida and people like that. I mean, I can see very much in retrospect how that was again that sort of strong undercurrent. And it was carrying me back towards the academy. And so I won't go into all the gory details, and what Booth did to sabotage it and everything, which he did. Oh, wow, was he canny. He was fighting for his family in his own way. But 4 weeks before I left to start teaching at the University of Nebraska, he filed for divorce. Again, he had done it once before, and I had, you know, hung in there and done the counseling. And, you know, we'd been separated for 18 months, and I had, you know, no, it's family, it's marriage, it's, you know, but this was, no. So I went off to Nebraska.
Now, I know your time at Nebraska was not always happy either.
Oh God, you know, I look back at all this and I try to think that that high school English teacher who was a wonderful friend for many, many years. And the first time I got denied tenure, she said, Emily, anybody worth their salt is fired at least twice in their lifetime. And I tried to hang on to that, but
So
yeah.
what was the atmosphere like at Nebraska when you came, and especially for women? And
There were 24 white males and one woman who said repeatedly, I am neither feminine nor a feminist. And you can book on that. okay, and she was not married and has never married. And when Marina Angel's article on the queen bee phenomenon in law schools, that she was a queen bee. And she said at one point, my first year, she said, "Emily, you're here because I thought I was finally ready for another woman." Well, she wasn't. She wasn't. Unfortunately, the interests that we shared, I did better than she did on, like law and literature, and when Jim White came to visit and the conversation that he and I had and what happened with that, she was not pleased.
So what the guys treated you, I take it, with?
They were just clueless. They were clueless. They'd never had an other. I mean, Jo was a category unto herself. And given the times, part of the deal at one point that somebody sort of tried to work out with me was that if I could neutralize Jo, that they would fight for me. And I said, no, I'm not. That's, no, you've created this dynamic. I'm not going after her.
Sure.
I mean, they wanted me really to go after her, and so they'd never had somebody who was really other. They'd been 24 white guys. And lots of them were very nice people and well-intentioned, but they were out in the middle of Nebraska and they just hadn't dealt with the difference.
So what about your experience with students? Did they treat you differently because you're a female law professor?
Oh, certainly. Oh, yeah. But, it was a topic, an explicit topic of conversation in lots of ways. And the Women's Law Student Association, they were so, did we have one even? We must have. But the women did, and they were unbelievably, especially the older, the returning students, were so supportive because they could just see it all happening. And there were just a lot of male students who, my own son, my second year there, at Halloween, okay, now this poor kid, he was only 11, I think, at the time, maybe 12. I get dressed up to go to the university on Halloween, and I dressed up as a law professor. Okay, I put on my tweed jacket. I put on a blue button-down collared shirt, a pair of corduroy slacks, loafers, and wore glasses. And his costume was, he was some kind of elf, and he had a beard. And so my friends who were messing, they said, "Oh, try the beard on." Put the beard on. And Ben said, "Oh, now you look like a law professor." Right? I mean, I tried to play with it, but it's how much of the truth can you play over and how much can you just, do what you can.
What important things did you do for your career or for your life while you were at Nebraska? What do you think were the things that were most important? Things you're proud of, things that were difficult for you other than what we talked about?
No, I went ahead and did the scholarly work that I wanted to do. And I was fortunate that people like Jim White and Tom Schaefer really affirmed that. They wrote beautiful letters, ones that, Jo shredded, but of support for me about my scholarship. And my colleagues just all went around saying, "I don't understand what she says." And so they considered my scholarship to be junk. But I did get this reflection back from these conversation partners who were really amazing
Yeah.
intellects.
And how did you meet them? Well, Jim came to Nebraska.
Yeah, he
How did
came
you
to
come?
do, some endowed lecture thing,
Mhm.
okay? And Tom, it's a long but wonderful story. I mean, it is a wonderful story, and I won't go into all, but it had to do with a guy at Notre Dame who was chair of the theology department and then chair of philosophy, and then because he had PhDs in both, and he was a Holy Cross priest, David Burrell. And he did some bridge stuff, but I wrote, I think Sandy Levinson was the one who had UT Law Review ask me to review Michael Novak's book for them. And I said, can I also review On Being a Christian and a Lawyer? And they said yes. And so that review got to Tom. Okay. And he felt that I had hurt him. And so that was, and I met him at Notre Dame. That just has to do with the part of the story that's another part of this sort of, how did I end up having an afternoon with Milo Vangelis in Belgrade? It's just wonderful intersections, things that you can't plan or achieve. You can just be grateful for.
So Nebraska, what made you leave there, and what?
I had to. Joe got me terminated a year early. It was just amazing. She used to go back during the summers to New Jersey to prosecute for free because she loved it. And she had a mouse, and she was just having, it was just vicious. It was really, and there was another strand in there that was a personal strand. One of the guys on the faculty that I dated that she considered to be her property, in a way that's, that's because the personal strand is always there.
Sure.
And it's always part of the motivation, and it's always part of the backstory. But I got, again, that there's sort of these encounters, these meetings that are so powerful. Derrida came to Nebraska, and my colleague that they, the usual suspect that they invited he was my best friend on the faculty. He was a wonderful, zany, wild guy, which a guy could get away with.
Mm-hmm.
All those things he was, but only a guy could get away with it. Very, very white, blue-eyed, had all of that going for him. A good guy. Anyway, he got me invited, and I was on the round table with Derrida, but also got to have dinner with him. And that encounter, and I then wrote to him, he wrote me back this extraordinary thing. All of that was something which fed my, because I played very much on all the feminist things. I used a riff on the Wizard of Oz and calling myself a good witch, and really trying to, again, play with those kinds of difference and the mystical, which Dorothy's tagline is a mystical one, about that obviously gave me some kind of energy that helped, again, carry me through. I had this interaction with Howard Lesnick, okay? And he was one of the people who said, hey, why don't you come, to Pennsylvania? And one of my Quaker friends said, why don't you come to Pendle Hill? And that's where I went. After Nebraska, I went and I spent a year at a Quaker contemplation center having a socially acceptable nervous breakdown, not really a nervous breakdown, but having a year of respite, which was just crucial. And Sally Palmer was the friend, she was absolutely crucial to it. And Quaker feminists are pretty cool. They have, the long history of all the abolitionists and
But
suffragists.
this also had an influence on what you've done since then, and scholarly, the Pendle Hill experience.
Oh yeah. But somewhere in there also, there was this piece where I wrote this article, which Joe Patuto attacked and shredded for the Journal of Law and Religion. And that connection.
Talk about that.
Well, it was an article about state constitutional law because, they put me where they wanted to in terms of teaching and gave me all these new preps, and state con law was one of them. And hermeneutics and Abraham Joshua Heschel and things like that. And it was clear to me, it was early enough on so that there hadn't been a lot of jurisprudence about it, about how hermeneutics and interpretation could in fact get great insight from hermeneutics in the traditions that have been doing it for centuries with texts, and that the notion of interiority that Heschel and others had could inform what your relationship to a text that you consider has some kind of authority beyond the surface of it. And I wrote it from that perspective and looked at the language in the original state constitutions and how language in constitutional law had changed and had become desiccated. All of these things that I was tremendously interested in. And I sent it off to the Journal of Law and Religion. And it was, it was wonderful. It was sort of the connection. Yes, there is a connection in the legal academy for all this weird, feminist, spiritual, postmodern, that was just, that was a very tangible kind of connection, along with that sort of the sense of the underlying flow. And that persevered across, the year when I wasn't literally in the academy, and people were really going after me. There were people who, I had people say, Harvey Perlman, who was the dean at Nebraska, wrote in something that what I was doing challenged the stability of Western civilization as why we need to get rid of her. And it was like, no, this is postmodernism. You got what I'm doing. But I'm doing it in a friendly way, Was that strand, that thread. I had already made the connection with the journal and with the law and religion section at AALS. And that carried over. And Howard Lesnick, because I did teach adjunct at Penn while I was there. So there were there were places, but it wasn't, I'd been denied tenure by then, I think, 3 times. I've been denied tenure 6 times, so a bunch of them were there, but some of them were at St. Mary's too.
So let's get to St. Mary's.
Okay,
From
so
Pendle Hill.
that you've got the 2 strands, because David, my second husband, was at Pendle Hill, and we were in a relationship by then, and after the actual, it was the 2nd year, and I stayed in Swarthmore, and I was still teaching adjunct at Penn and sort of trying to figure out what to do, and he was also in a sort of post. It's a very powerful experience, Pendle Hill, and he said, my mom is now 80. Will you look at Texas? And I was, okay, I'll look at Texas. And I think it was Doug Laycock who connected me with Barbara Aldave. And, that was part of the law and religion section, all that was Doug. He has been he's got a whole set of ducklings at the conference this year. You see him with them. He's very good about being generous with younger people. And Barbara Aldave was, it was an extraordinary fit, because she went to St. Mary's to do Catholic social justice stuff. She said, I'm here to educate brown women who haven't been educated and need that opportunity, in a Catholic social justice context. And it was like, because I knew that all my postmodernism was in fact predated by the Catholic mysticism, but all mysticisms, they're connected. That's, Merton's Zen and the Birds of Appetite, you know, David Tracy's Dialogue with the Other, you know, with both of them with Zen Buddhas. It's all connected. And so it was clear to me that there was no place that I would rather be than, and it was Camelot for a while.
Yeah, and why don't we talk a little bit about that? What was Camelotish about it?
Well, here you had this woman dean who was the first lay president of Network, which it was the nuns. It's the nuns on the bus. It's the lefty nuns. It's the wonderful, you know, the women in my tradition that are just such a gift. The Holy Spirit's really going to have to think hard to figure out what follows that cadre of vowed religious. And Barbara was in thick with them, and here she was at a Catholic university, and the relatively new president had gotten, and you know, her story is her story, but the way she got the job was this extraordinary story. And so she was bringing in people who could have gone to a lot of different places, and did when the crap hit the fan, that were sort of more prestigious, but were coming because she was growing clinics for, you know, the homeless and death penalty clinic and stuff. But see, that was the beginning of Party and the death penalty clinic, and the good old boys got really, you know, assigned her a death penalty representation case. Just they were so. She was the first woman dean. She was the first dean of the law school not invited immediately to join Club Giroux, which is the club. I mean, so here she was getting all of this backlash. I mean, she was sort of the prow of the boat cutting through the waters where people were just going nuts at what she was doing. And she was taller, stronger, and smarter than most of them. And had good things to say about everybody, including the ones who were, you know, trashing her, which made it, in some ways, made it harder, sure, I think, for people. And so there was a sort of gathering of energy and consciousness movement among the faculty, and it reached its limit. And when it reached its limit, that was part of what ended it. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And during this period when she was there, what were you doing? What kind of role did you play in that law school?
Well, what my colleagues said about me was, what she does is soft law and we need hard law. And I mean, they used all these metaphors inadvertently, sure, that were saying essentially, we have had too much of this stuff.
So what classes, for instance, were you teaching?
I started out teaching torts. Mm-hmm. I pressed buttons, and I still don't understand fully. You know, I have to sort of trust that this is part of a whole thing, because I didn't mean to, but the guy he was a leftover as a TA, because the man I was replacing had had a heart attack, so it was a sudden replacement to put me in torts. I hadn't taught it before, but that's fine. So I had his leftover TA. Mm-hmm. This guy had, you know, the motorcycle full body suits. Okay, he had this red flame painted, you know, with the red, you know, whole, I mean, you know, when I saw him later, it was like, oh gosh. And he literally misheard what I said about things. So he reported me to Molly Ivan's brother, called me up at one point and said, did you really teach, you know, just tell me about negligent infliction of emotional distress in Texas? What I had said was, there was just a case that decided that there's no negligent recovery for negligent infliction of emotional distress in Texas, okay? What the guy heard was, there is recovery for, and he went and told everybody, and, you know, including, you know, and so when Molly's brother called me up, I said, well, you know, and there was the so-and-so case, and he said, and that's what you said in class, right? And I said, well, yeah, that's what I said in class, and I talked some about it, and I, you know. I mean, I really believe that one of my favorite verses in Scripture is the one about the splinter in your eye. And my perspective is also partial. I have a log in my eye. I can't see, and I will never see clearly, including about gender. Because I can see all my mistakes following me, you know. I mean, you try to befriend them. You try to say, well, now I've learned something, you know, rather than being defensive about it because I'm dumb in so many ways. I mean, I'm not, I don't believe that any of us has really, I mean, there may be ways that you can foreshorten your vision and widen it to some extent. There probably are, but, you know, I believe in universal salvation, so I'm not sure about that, okay? But the perceptual screens of the guys at that point, and it was over, they said it appeared on teaching evaluations, not just mine. Aldave and her crew are hostile to white males. And that's what they thought was happening. That essentially if you try to talk about displacing the default categories, but we're all still human, okay, and we all benefit from that, because if you're displaced from the default category, that means you can nurture your children. There are all kinds of things you didn't used to be able to do, you can do. I mean, they're just like, it's win-win. They were in the, you're attacking us, you're belittling us, you're demeaning us. And they're, you know, it's South Texas. I mean, well, it's Trump time.
Sure.
It's still going on, right? People are incredibly angry, they feel threatened.
How did the women students experience all this?
They were experiencing, as one of my students put it to me, and she was so bright. She was from a very economically non-advantaged background up in Louisiana, young African-American woman who, she learned to swim extremely well, but it was tough. She said, let's just say you're controversial. Okay, so they knew, and you know, a lot of the students don't want to get involved in the controversy, which I respect completely. They have lives, you know, there are other things at stake. Mm-hmm. So my experience at St. Mary's in particular, though if I look back, I think it was happening at Nebraska too, and at Penn, and at Tulane when I visited also, is that it's that intersection of what's going on in their lives and what's going on in the classroom. And so it really is more about them. So when you say, how did they experience it? There was one semester when the women, it was incredible what they did, intellectually and everything. They got into Plato and postmodern and literary criticism in the law and literature class in a way that was just, they were so, well, it turns out that two of them were getting divorced at that time and were on law review and were among our, and they were brilliant. And they both didn't pass the bar. And they're not sorry, in a sense, right? But the way the sort of, there aren't a lot of straight lines in what was going on. Okay, so they really needed that involvement for that. And, you know, one of them in particular, you know, had stayed in touch for quite a, you know, and said, I would have lost my mind if it hadn't been for that. But, you know, a lot of other people are going, is this a law school? Right?
So post-Aldave, what have been the successes and the disappointments of your career at St. Mary's? What do you want to tell us about that?
Well, it was literally as Barbara left that I was finally given tenure. Okay? Huge fight, all kinds of stuff, you know. Denials, though, I found out how many, huge number of my colleagues were also denied tenure at least once, if not twice. Okay, so part of that's the pattern of that institution, which fortunately has changed. I got the news that I got tenure from Beto Juarez as I'm walking into my first meeting with Bill Pyatt. And I do call him, and this is in quotes, it's not meant to be a valid descriptor, it's meant to be, I call him the anti-dean because Barbara was, for me, for what I wanted in a dean. Barbara was remarkable. She wasn't perfect, but she was remarkable. And Bill Pyatt was remarkable in the other direction. Mm-hmm. And so I spent, for reasons that I don't fully understand, I haven't fully processed, but it's up to the love in the universe to decide about these things. 9 years putting a tremendous amount of my energy into internal processes at St. Mary's. Because at one point I got a letter out of the blue, no process, no notice, no formal charges, nothing, okay? It was December, the week after the end of classes. We were doing mediation training. I go to at lunch, my office, on my chair is a letter from, was it provost? I forget. Academic vice president, I think, suspending me, barring me from campus, and slating me for dismissal for supposedly violating a grading policy, which I didn't. But which, the AAUP guy eventually said, no, they're not crazy to write the letter. They'd be crazy to try actually get rid of you. They're trying to be so vicious that you'll quit. And that's what they were trying to do, and they were trying to break tenure in part at the university. Some people were, not everybody. And they didn't break my tenure. It's like, hell, I fought for it so much. It's like, and if I had, the settlement that I was offered was outrageous. But how could you take money? I can't imagine why they thought that I would, after all of that, think that it was something they could buy. And what it would have meant for my colleagues who were, Beto Juarez could tell you a story. He's not part of this project, but, he's one of the many who could tell you, if they were willing, just amazing things that they did. And there's paper to back it up, and it's mind-boggling. And it was mind-boggling. So I lived in this period where I was, and there were specifics, and here I don't want to name names except, well, there were some people who were very helpful. There were some women who were really helpful. Okay, I'm looking at one of them now, who did things to try to help me. And Pyatt would come in and corner their dean in an elevator, and and you tell somebody something, and they may not believe it, but it tells them this is just not something I can touch. And I mean, he did it to me, he did it to other people. So you're living in this surreal world where there is a level of, Pyatt described himself to me as a street fighter in that first meeting. And yeah, he didn't specify which part of the street, but no question. But for me, here's the joke, I think, is that after all of that, and now there was another dean in between, and there were still all these repercussions because of it. Right. That my trajectory in terms of writing and scholarship, it was just, I was writing grievances and, trying to save my job. Pyatt did something just about 6 weeks ago where he physically confronted me in a relatively dark hallway after stalking. I mean, it was really inappropriate, okay? And, you know, Emily, I hope we're not going to have a fight about, you know, and I said, I've had my say. I walked him, and I told the dean, who said, oh, creepy. And it was creepy. I mean, it was scary, because he's just, in my experience, somebody who's out of control of the usual norms of behavior that one could expect. I've been doing all of this work with prisoners, and it's really been nourishing to me in so many ways, and sort of being in a postmodern space really, for me, opens up just a lot of what's happening. I had mentioned they don't know what I do or anything. You know, we'd check in. I said, it was a tough week at work because my former boss did something that was really, you know, it intimidated me, and I was really thrown off. They wanted to know his name and where he lived. And
They have your back.
Well, it was, you know, if you're a street fighter, ironically, apparently if I wanted to tap into that, I could. And I mean, I can't make linear sense out of it because I really did care about the academic conversations, okay? I cared about that stuff. And that did get shredded. But what's really important and what's really happening exceeds my understanding. And so I think I'm more comfortable now with saying, I don't know what's happening.
Okay.
Okay?
Is it possible to articulate what you think the important, what the legacy is, what you have left at St. Mary's, what successes you've had, however you want to describe
that
it?
I think I really, really don't know and have been in the process of letting go of. It's like watching the Journal of Law and Religion, okay? That no longer really exists for me, what it was, okay? It's not that there's not something called that,
Sure.
but you know, the community and the people and the, you know, the spiritual, intellectual, political, institutional space isn't there, right? But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that it's the tomb time, it's the waiting for resurrection. And ironically, I'm not going to be around at the resurrection, I think. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to be around in a totally different perspective. And so every once in a while there'll be a little thing where somebody will say something to me when I'll sort of say, oh God, you know, I haven't, you know, and we'll say something like, well, but your article, you know, the law is invitation, that changed the way I saw law. Now, this is somebody that, you know, it didn't, I know a lot of the negative stuff. I've gotten a lot of that feedback. But the ones where, you know, where there's been, like the women I described in that one class, how do you know what the consequences are? How do I know what the consequences are? So I can look and I can say, I have a corpus of articles, a number of which I think are not dated, actually, of which I'm proud, if being proud is the right category. It's not quite the right category, but I'm happy that I wrote them. And I'm not sure if I'm going to write anymore. I keep thinking, no, I'm not going to, and then I think, oh, maybe I will. You know, something comes up, and you know, and I'm listening for the maybe I will. But I don't know. I don't know. When I went back to Pendle Hill after there, guess what? There was a controversy while I was at Pendle Hill. They called it the gender issue. And there were 4 of us that were at the center of it. I found out there was this whole story I had no idea about. And there were all these people who were going, oh, you were, you know. I literally had not, because what I had heard, this is my tendency, is to hear the negative stuff. I can tell you all the negative. I told you, you know, almost all of it. And the positive stuff, I'm not in control of. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yes.
And so I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, I survived that. I sort of know. But what the consequences are, I think I'm really good at my prison ministry. I think it's all contributed to that.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it's just I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to be.
No, it's okay. Any things you want to, I haven't asked you about, any stories of your life that are important that you haven't had a chance to record that would be important to you?
No, I'm just thinking there about all the, you know, they're just wonderful people along the way, and in a way I haven't focused, you know, haven't said as much about, you know, obviously you, you know, but Howard Vogel, and Earl Schwartz. I use his letter from Birmingham jail. Just so many wonderful experiences and the people that, and at St. Mary's, the folks, most of whom were driven off, including Barbara. And that was a calculated thing. They don't do that anymore. They're much kinder to the deans now. So there was a consequence, in a sense, of what happened to Barbara. And I think there's a consequence of what happened to me in terms of there being that 9-year period where, you know, Charles Cantu, who was the dean, but just the whole, people weren't eating each other anymore, okay? And so I think that it's the Rene Girard thing. I think that there are consequences of violence which not our wisdom, but the force of love does transform. And so for that, for all the people who are part of that transformation, I'm just so grateful.